Mark, can you hear us?
Yeah, we're ready to start the recording now. Also, there's some stuff happening.
You need to turn your mic on.
Hey, no. Tyson, also remind me of the public comment and the timing of that.
Yes.
Okay. So call to order, Peter Eckel, Budget Advisory Committee.
Laura Cooper, Budget Advisory Committee.
Kevin Ingles, Director of Finance.
Tyson Thornburg, Budget and Financial Analyst.
Rita Russell, Council Liaison.
Steve Ward, Council Liaison.
Tim Dodd, Deputy City Manager.
Andrew Forlines, non-voting alternate member.
Nevin Mondal, Budget Advisory Committee.
Jay Knight, Budget Advisory Committee.
Do we have anybody online? Doesn't look like it. Okay. Can I get a motion to approve our meeting minutes from, goodness, was that last week? Last week, August meeting.
I'll move.
Seconded.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. And I think now is our public comment. I don't know that we have anybody from the public here. Okay, so we'll move on. New business, and I believe our only business for today, and we'll talk about the schedule at the end of the meeting. Our goal is to go through some of the levers and some of the things that we want to consider in providing council with and the city with a what I'll call a recommended reserve policy or reserve policy guidance. And I'd like us to get to where we can start deciding on some functional levers and so that we can wrap this up, I'll say by the end of the October meeting. So that gives us 30 days, and I think we can do that. I'm going to let Laura start and walk us through this guidance that she put together, and feel free to interject or ask questions.
Great, thank you, Peter. So put together some policy guidance and recommendations, at least as a starting point for our discussion, based on the areas that I had heard additional guidance was needed. This is pretty long, so I will probably jump around quite a bit here. But essentially, when we look at the context, we know the context here, but recognizing that while the policy provides that range and the ability to ratchet down or slide up, there's some additional, more specific guidance that's been requested. Specifically, those areas would be that I've heard, and they may not be comprehensive, we may need to add to it, but whether or not I think we're affirming that range and the target. Clarifying some of the use conditions, when to ratchet and when to slide, especially. Some details about any sort of maybe documentation that would be required or desired for ratcheting or for sliding. Some sort of replenishment strategy to augment, especially if we're going to dip below what the target is. And then there's some other mechanisms that have been recommended by this committee. And so that is where I wanted to start us. But I've done some research with some different sources, GFOA. There's some Pew research as well. It's more specific to states, and so it'll be interesting to see how applicable it is at the city level. But I will leave the external guidance in there as a reference, and you all can refer to that later. But we will keep moving to, I believe the next section is just reserve philosophy. My understanding is that we essentially are pretty aligned with the policy in terms of having the ratcheting and sliding, having a range, having a target, but recognizing, I think, kind of overall that it should be augmented with clear use and replenishment or rebuilding guidelines, especially to ensure that sort of clarity or and transparency with the public as well, and to provide some guidance to council. So that is sort of kind of overall reserve philosophy that I had written up. Are there any, do we want to pause and take any comments or questions at that point, or should I keep going to summarize?
No, let's pause a second. I will
Great.
add, hey, James, how are you? Good to see you. I was just going to note that on the maintain greater than or equal to 2 months unrestricted fund balance. So I looked, and granted I will need to check the finalized 24 amounts, but based on the amended budget, which I don't know if there's 1 or 2 amendments in 24, but at least I show one. And it looked like our gross revenue was about $69.5 million. And so just to provide a dollar amount, last year, 2024, that would have been equal to $11,568,000, just to give us an idea. Now, I don't know where we are today on the unrestricted balance amount, and also I don't know what our expected 25 total revenue number is going to be.
So our original budget for 2025 was to have 0 unassigned fund balance to be right around that 16.7% reserve rate. I just presented the July monthly financial report for 2025 on Tuesday, and it looks like we're going to come in a little bit better than that. It's still early in the year, but the trend is that we'll probably have around $500,000 in unrestricted reserve. So that's what our current estimate is.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I just wanted to note too, just on the external guidance portion, adopt a written policy that addresses conditions for use of reserves as well as time frame and means of replenishment, which I know I'm kind of rehashing a little bit of what Laura said, but that is what was written here. And then one of the things I wanted to note too, that part of us finding sort of metrics and sort of a ratchet to determine some of these adjustments was around determine whether the rainy day fund's usage is in line with its purpose and create clear and measurable withdrawal conditions based on volatility, which I think is very interesting when we look at greater economic determinants. And so the few that I've noted that we should consider would include the volatility index, or VIX. It's kind of a complicated calculation, which I can tell the group more about it. But, it's a good measure and indicator of volatility, and it tracks, it typically tracks some stress levels partly out of the market, but also showing correlation between a 10-day change in the market and and also economic conditions such as a recession. And I think in the financial crisis of 2008, the VIX was a very predictable measure of that crisis occurring. Another one I added was GDP, which is a relatively simple calculation, which we could go into. And the third one that I also noted would be the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, or EPU. And it's a measure of economic uncertainty that is constructed by tracking the frequency of newspapers, which I know sounds sort of old school, but certainly would be a way to gather and understand what's going on in the economy, economic conditions, business conditions, government, regulation, tax, Federal Reserve, Congress, terms like that. And there's also scaling and standardization. So I think those are three things that I had to add, and I did have one more note that on the replace repayment provisions with deposits tied to volatility, I didn't know if anybody had any thoughts on that before we went back to the philosophy. Oh, and one more thing, the strongest credit for fund balance in cash. I thought that was an interesting metric. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little more.
Regarding that, that is what I had found in my research. I'd be curious to validate at what point of our reserves would we be at risk of a credit rating, like of a re-rating or a notice or something like that. I think that would be an important threshold to understand. So that was what I was saying, but I think it was a little bit out of date potentially. So
I think that's really important. And I think that understanding that credit rating basis should be one of the key things that should be part of our reserve policy recommendation, because that obviously limits our access to money, it limits our access to debt, and potentially even maybe even the ability to issue bonds.
One thing that I'd just like to add is I think one of the key elements that I'll be looking at in my philosophy for these recommendations is just how much can we standardize the process. I think a key part of a reserve policy is that it should be something that people are able to anticipate, and that in creating this policy, I think we might also want to look at elements of the existing policy, such as calculating that 16.7, which we have functionally been calculating it the same way year to year, but if you actually read the policy, there's enough leeway in there that future city councils may interpret it differently, which could also impact the way that the reserve policy that we create functions as pretty significant.
yeah, I agree with that. And would that be specifically about the base of expenditures versus revenue? Great. Yeah, we can actually maybe jump into that section as well. Would love to hear any discussion or debate on this point in particular, but I agree that the phrase as written in the current policy, whichever is more predictable, operating revenues or expenditures, could benefit from clarification. I think that we should have some maybe historical analysis to get this validated through the finance team, but my understanding, while we have been doing expenditures as kind of the default, is that that would be for us more stable and predictable, especially given how volatile a heavy sales tax revenue base is, in terms of those fluctuations and the amount of kind of more granular control we have over our own expenditures, or at least planning for those. So yeah, I would love to hear any comment or debate on that.
Yeah, for the most part, I agree wholeheartedly, especially, I think we've seen the possibility for that to shift. Obviously, our accounting team has been calculating the same year to year, but I think maybe just updating the language to reflect our current practice and specify that a little bit more would make sense as we tried to create a process here.
Yeah, one question I had as I was looking at this is how much of this will be guidance to council and how much will need to be written into the actual policy or, and submitted for a vote. That was one kind of unknown that I had. Don't know if anybody else has any clarity on that.
No, that's a good point, and I think that's something that we should decide on today, really. And I like that you highlighted whichever is more predictable. And just to put a metric to that, and I can share this spreadsheet with the group, I'll add 25 before, well, this week and have it circulated. But if we look I have 2011 through 2024. And between call it year-over-year change of expenditures to revenue, or expenditures year-over-year, between 2011 and 2018, we averaged 1.8% expenditure growth. Since 2019, we have, through 2024, which is also, how many years is that? 6 years. We averaged 8.4% expenditure growth. So I think this is a really valid point. I would say just on that, although, revenues are up pretty squarely too, and I'll calculate those numbers here in a second for you. But I think expenditures have been growing significantly in the last 6 years.
And if I could just add a little bit of additional information on that, you may want to consider operations versus capital. We've invested heavily in capital in that 2018 to 24 period.
Thanks, Kevin.
So those would be my thoughts on reserve calculation base. I don't know if we have other comments on that. I think kind of the meat and potatoes of some of this is looking at what do we recommend around reserve usage and replenishment strategy. So would love to save some time for that discussion. Yeah.
Agreed. And I just calculated the revenue adjustments. So from we'll use the same basis, 2012 year over year through 2018. Revenue grew on average 4.3% compared to expenses growing at 1.8%. And then for the next 6 years, 2019 through 2024, revenues grew at 5.3%, which is pretty good. But that was over offset by expense, which grew at 8.4%, just to give you an idea. And I'll share this with the group after this meeting.
I don't want to get too sidetracked with recent, spending behaviors versus recent municipal income, but I will say I think a significant contributor to that, in addition to our recent capital spending, were also some of the voter mandates over that period as well.
How do you think that compares to other municipalities? Just on a general trend basis, or maybe city council or the city has some thought about it. Or maybe we need to put some basis behind it to see. But I think that we call it voter indebtedness and tax. And one of the most prolific states, we'll just say at state level, is California. And since 2001 or 2002, the voters have approved every school bond measure, which is not surprising. So I think there's certainly is a trend around voter indebtedness and sort of growing financial obligations to, funding more expense, which comes at the cost of, government, due to, taxpayers asking for more. I think that's a good point.
I'm curious when it comes to predictability of those metrics, if that is more in line with forecasting for a given year versus the change over time. And because I think when you look at it from a year perspective, we would maybe expect that operating revenues would be less predictable than operating expenditures, even if their growth rate is different. I'm curious if that would factor in when it comes to calculating the range, if the predictability is more based on within kind of forecast versus actuals.
Yeah, well, that's true, because this is a this is a immediate decision, right, to adjust the reserve policy. And so how far back do we look? And I think establishing a time frame for that's important.
And I'll just add, we have a little more control over expenditures than we do revenues because they're internally generated. That's a big part of the reason we use expenditures now.
And that makes sense too, I guess, because economic downturns certainly would impact revenues. Obviously, with our inflationary environment right now, expenditures, and just proven point here on this ledger that, yeah, expenditures are growing too, because let's face it, the government's printed a lot of money since COVID. So I think that also exasperates the situation. And Laura, I think the recommendation is that expenditures is more stable, right?
That would be my recommendation, subject to maybe review some basis from the finance team, from city staff. I think that would be a request we could make. I would love to talk about maybe reserve usage. The pieces that I have identified as, and I think that we all have through hearing from council as potentially useful to augment, would be building out the reserve usage framework a bit to include a list of eligible uses that's a little bit more specifically for drawing down those reserves below what our target is, but within the acceptable range. Establishing some of those trigger thresholds for a review for ratcheting down and for sliding up. And then some documentation requirements for drawdown proposals, especially, I think a lot of that is probably already happening internally, but I think documenting that and having it available to the public would be useful from a transparency accountability standpoint. Yeah.
Are there any, just to be specific, in the current policy, are there any stated eligible uses, and are there any drawdown specified determinations?
I saw somewhere there was like a bulleted list of could include something like that. I would need to reference the exact policy. Let's see if I can find that. But yeah, I do think it's kind of less of a comprehensive and more of these are some potential examples. So that could be tightened up.
Okay.
Yeah, some point E there. It looks like it's referencing section 3C3, right? Maybe used for one-time operational or capital amounts. Oh no, I guess that's in excess. No.
Do we know if the city has ever reduced its operating expenditures specifically for the reserve? I don't think so, given that we've always, at least in recent history, been above the 12%.
Well, that is part of the budget process that we go through. We do look at expenditures heavily if we know we're not going to meet whatever range council has asked us to meet.
I don't know that I'm seeing a list in here. It looks like it's referencing a budget gap used to offset operating expenditures in excess of revenues. The guidance that I was looking at, that was, again, admittedly, it's for states to consider, but the guidance there was a budget gap is not enough because there's a lot of drivers of a budget gap that could also signal, bad governance or poor planning. And so that there would be a desire to see some due diligence beyond just there's a budget gap, which I think is why I would love to see some eligible uses itemized in the policy. The ones that I had suggested as a starter list were declared emergencies or disasters, including loss of a major revenue source, national or regionally just declared recessions, local revenue shortfalls, one-time inflationary spikes, and then some conditions that are outlined that we could outline in the trigger dashboard. Don't know that that is comprehensive. Again, I think some of that historical analysis might be useful to see what are the drivers of any time we've experienced maybe at a reforecast and a budget gap would have been those drivers. But I don't know, would you say that there's anything missing from this list? Anybody identify some?
Yeah, I think it's good.
Agreed. I think it's great. And I think these 5 here, a month of reflection, maybe we come up with 1 or 2 more, but I think this is a very good start, or maybe a complete list, maybe mostly complete list. And I think we need to put a lever or metric or 2 or 3 to each of those that, we look at a GDP index, or we look at, an inflation metric, or we look at other sort of economic triggers. And I do like also the loss of major revenue source. I mean, these are all very, very good. This is a very good start, I think.
So, when we had kind of a similar discussion during the last cycle, one thing that we touched on and we didn't really go much further with it is relating more to some of the potentially like cyclical revenue dips, but also some potential economic trends over time, both as a way of potentially drawing on and as a way to mark when to replenish these funds. We talked about looking at 3-year indicators with potential exceptions for significant changes in inflation, and some of these markers I think might actually be good additions, but potentially I think having potential long-term markers as well as setting like a basis for some of these exceptions could be good guidance. I don't necessarily think that we should recommend that the council lock themselves in so that those are the only times that they can adjust it, but I think that providing consistent guidance based off of these metrics can give a better standard by which to adjust.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm curious what some of those would be. Some of the ones that have been discussed, or I'm trying to remember.
Like specifically, are you looking at some of the long-term drivers that we were looking at? I think long-term drivers included like 3-year revenue trends. I believe that we also talked about like having a potential like population trend or something like that. I think that we maybe talked about at some point like the number of businesses located within Englewood and just like potential trends there. But I think last year we didn't really get into too much detail. It was all very, very high level.
and maybe I did read through this earlier, so if I'm jumping ahead, just stop me. But we're looking at purely the 16.7 number, and is there a point where we expand above that and say, we need to put some cash back? Because certainly we know I feel like we're focused around when are we going to draw it down, but also when do we over reserve, right? And so there would need to be some advanced indicators there as well.
Personally, whenever possible, I don't think revenue or expenditures really give us that clear of an idea. I think a ratio of operational operational expenditures relative to the relevant revenues is very, very helpful, whereas we can maybe take some of the capital expenditures or cyclical expenditures that we know to expect every couple of years out of consideration, so that it doesn't change our forecast in a way that we can actually anticipate ahead of time.
And going above the 16.7, it might be something simple like it. If we have surplus, then we're able to add to it. But that surplus from that year doesn't continue on. It's either there for a downturn the following year, or it just ends up being used and we revert back down to 16.7.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump ahead into some of the trigger thresholds, both for ratcheting down, but also sliding up, which I think is relevant to this conversation. And yeah, I think replenishment strategy is sort of part of that, but some of that is, even if it hasn't dipped below 16.7%, what are we doing with, a one-time windfall with revenues that are up? Yeah, so these were very much starter ones that I thought that I could come up with some sort of justification for, connected to some of the usages. But just going through these real quickly, year-over-year revenue decline, I do wonder how relevant that is for us versus flattening revenue, or with the high inflation shocks. So would be curious about that one, but as a way to ratchet down, or a trigger to ratchet down. Op spending overruns as a 2% over budget, ratcheting down. High inflation shock, so that I think is more relevant to where we're at right now, and was trying to think of what would be some metrics that could capture our revenue is growing, but also our expenditures are growing in a way that we weren't anticipating. Some of those revenue, and so I think that one potential to look at is not only the consumer price index, but also a ratio of consumer price index to revenue growth, which might kind of control for that. And then the declared emergency or recession indicators also being an opportunity to ratchet down. For sliding up, I had listed considering multi-year use. So if reserves are being tapped more than 2 consecutive years, that might be something that's maybe on the longer term trends. I'm not sure if that one is valuable or not. Kind of the opposite of the expenditure overrun would be the underspending. The revenue booms or windfall, I think, is a really good opportunity for sliding up. And we can look at a trend. The one that I put in there is used by the state of Virginia, I think, and so it's just kind of a default that has been used in some cases. And then, of course, I think the idea would be to avoid any sort of rating action or watch, but if that were to ever happen, that's a very clear trigger to slide up. So, yeah, would love thoughts or feedback.
Can you scroll up just a little?
Really appreciate you putting these together. When I was looking at these, I definitely think that a lot of these are good indicators. I do think there is some potential for having similar types of indicators for ratcheting up and ratcheting down, right? Like, I I think revenue decline is a solid indicator, but it may be more helpful in the form of relative ratio between revenue and expenditures. But I think I kind of like the idea of having the consumer price index be its own indicator separate of revenue, just for the sake of not having revenue define each potential indicator. Because if one, given that we are very reliant on sales tax, there is potential for that to vary significantly. And two, I think we do want some, if there is, you know, some sort of oddity in the data, we want to be able to look at these indicators and glean an overall sense of the economy. And while certainly we've seen significant shifts to both revenue and to inflation recently, I think being able to look at those as separate pieces of the puzzle without them influencing each other may be helpful for just weeding out any data discrepancies or oddities.
I think it's important to note that these would also be maybe triggers for a review, because you can have one of these indicators, but you know, the other ones are in a different place, and yeah, financially we're in a very different place, and so that may be triggering a review in the context of some of the others as well.
Right, certainly some intensity metric that would combine factors, right?
My dream, and I don't know that we have the capacity as this committee, and certainly probably not within 30 days, would be to create separate tables for each indicator, and based on that table, which would essentially show like various ranges, and based on the range in that indicator over time, we would look at we would provide a recommendation for how to adjust the scale, and then a review would be triggered, but the recommendation information would be there. So these are abstract numbers, but you know, if we saw like 0.5 to 0.8% consistent increase over the time span, then we could recommend, you know, 0.5% increase to our reserve, whereas on the opposite side, we could recommend, you know, like a point for the same indicators. We could provide a recommendation for like a 0.3 draw on those reserves, right? If we saw the same decline in the other direction. And for each of these indicators, so we'd have one for relative revenue over expenditures, one for CPI. We'd have these tables that could essentially give council a tool that they can look at, and then based off of their own understanding, they can say, well, here's what the tool says. We're going to actually adjust it by this number, but here, you know, they have a basis by which to draw on when making their decision.
I'm curious what the council liaisons think about if we had something like this and then we had tables associated with these different trigger conditions. Does that sound like something that would be useful and helpful? Or does it sound like we're on the right track with that discussion? Flip a coin.
I think some of it might be helpful, but maybe not. I mean, policy itself, generally, the city staff deals with that and then makes recommendations to council based on what the policy is. And I mean, for me, I don't know that it would help me. I mean, I watch other things that just gives me a gut feeling about which way things are going. Because I am not a financial person. Being on this committee and actually being on another committee, retirement board, has helped me a lot in understanding how to do this. But I don't know. I would like something specific, and I think what you're giving are specific things, but somebody needs to be able to assess that. And I think there are some council members that would be able to assess that, perhaps like Councilmember Ward, but probably not all council members. So I don't know if that helps you. Clear as mud.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I think this is very direct guidance, and to me, it looks like the type of guidance that council has been asking for close to a decade at this point. I think one of the things that the body struggles with is understanding we have a pool of money that we can use, and we have put some structure around that pool of money, but we don't really know when it's okay to dip into the pool and when we have to add more water to the pool, or money, as the case may be. And so these types of things, while the policymaking body might not necessarily agree with the criteria, it definitely gives us a place to start. I will say the one that caught my eye is reserves tapped greater than 2 consecutive years signals a possible structural issue. And I think that really is kind of one of the standards that I intend to use going forward, should I remain on council, is we can't continuously take money out of the reserves to fill in operational holes, but it is there for a reason, which is to ensure the continuity of government when the economic conditions change unexpectedly. And these items, as I look through them, are doing a pretty good job of defining how economic conditions can change and what an appropriate response would be to that. So I like this as a start. I think the whole body should be looking at it. And I think this is very helpful and kind of what we've been shooting for a while.
So can I ask a question, whether it's to you or not? This will make a huge difference if there's a huge unassigned fund balance or if there's not an unassigned fund balance. I've always looked at the reserve policy as a certain amount of money that needs to be there for the 2 months buffer. But so I guess if we're assuming that there is always going to be zero in the unassigned fund balance, then probably this would be helpful. So how do you take into account the unassigned fund balance in conjunction with this?
And I think it's something we add. And that's a great point.
I am wondering what would be considered kind of a right-sized policy as well. I certainly don't feel up. I would love to have those kind of the proper benchmarking and the proper thresholds. I don't feel up to the task of creating those or doing that financial analysis. Maybe some of you all or some city staff would be able to support in that. So, yeah, this is probably the part where I feel like the least certain about which indicators and which, don't know.
When it comes to crafting the policy, very, very new to government here, so bear with me. Is there room in something where, like, we know, let's say we have a preponderance of triggers from green to yellow to red, and we've got 3 yellows, and that takes the recommendation, or the recommendation of the policy can be anywhere from council likely needs to really take this seriously to this really needs to be done. Like, does the policy allow for stages of emergency, I guess? Or does it need to be written in stone? This is exactly what you do.
Part of the benefit of the policy and what we want to balance is the reason it's a range is to allow for a little bit of flexibility to very complex situations. So I don't want to lose that agility, especially for future councils. It's like, where do we need the financial guidance and some of that documentation, some of those other pieces, and where is, kind of generally when to ratchet, when to slide versus the specificity. Because if we have the specificity, then I think we would just have, like, if we could come up with that, we'd probably just have the finance team give an exact number each year that should be the reserve. So I don't know exactly where that point is, but I don't want to lose one.
Can I ask another question, and perhaps Kevin can answer this for us? I've been on council 10 years, and during that time, we did establish a reserve policy. So it seems like even before I was on council, either we always had a lot of money or we had very little. So like in 2016, when we decided to talk about this and establish a reserve policy, was it because the unassigned fund balance and the reserves were very low? Do you know that historically?
No, I don't think it was because there was any big drop in the reserves. I think it was just more to get something in writing that council could rely on or use as a guidance.
Okay. And I think this all makes sense, but is it really going to make, I think when we're going to find out if it's going to make sense right now is we've drained the unassigned fund balance down to almost zero. And so now this is going to become far more critical, I believe, since there is not money anyplace else.
And going into next year, we're going to be ratcheting this down already.
I wonder if it's worth jumping ahead, pausing on the specific triggers, unless there's other comments, look at some of the other ideas, because I think that might maybe even satisfy some of the concerns, but some of maybe the documentation requirements and other maybe general conditions and guidance might be supportive. So let's go back up, actually, I think, to documentation requirements for reserve usage. I thought something either in the policy language or as a recommendation to augment the policy a bit that, let me see, would love to see basically, again, I think some of this might be happening, but if we are going to dip into the reserves below the target, but within the range, would love to see some just, required documentation around that. Would be curious how onerous this would be for staff, or if it's already happening, but it would be nice to have maybe a written explanation of the cause, especially in line with the purpose of the reserve policy being to, handle some of those revenue dips, those cyclical issues, and I think longer term economic conditions. Actions that are already taken to reduce costs and capture efficiencies, because I think the purpose of a reserve also is to consider if we're going to dip into the reserves, what efficiencies have we reached, and potentially, finance director, city manager sign off on that as kind of a public artifact. So that would be one maybe recommendation from me to add into the policy or to add just as recommendation guidance to council. Any thoughts on that?
So from my perspective, I think I don't want to put too much burden on council's ability to take action based off of what they see needing to be done. I do think there is potentially a rationale to make it so that additional justification or documentation, and in my mind, I'd like to, if we are going that route, maybe it's a public document, right, that is provided explaining the rationale. But I don't think that that's necessary for like every dip between 16.7. I think there's a difference in dipping from like 16.7 to like 15 point something, as opposed to like a dip, below the 12%, which we were at a number of years ago, or lower than that. I think, those are pretty significant differences, and I think potentially we could consider, in order to strike a balance between giving the council members relative autonomy and not creating like the need for them to create additional documentation when they're already trying to figure out an economic situation. I think a way that we could balance that is only really requiring this documentation. And again, I kind of like the idea of having it be a public-oriented document when the dip falls below, or when the dip caused for the reserve to go below a certain threshold.
Related to that, and Laura, I really appreciate the specificity and the examples that you include throughout the document. Was there any consideration given to some bumpers around what percentage drop would be allowable in a given year?
Yeah, I think that is a discussion as well. I put that in other mechanisms as a potential like annual drawdown guideline. And yeah, would be really curious. I think there was a suggestion of 2%. And so I don't know, that might be a guidance we want to consider if we feel like that is properly benchmarked.
I mean, the 2% that I recommended was not very quantitatively decided upon. It was looking at the current situation and understanding that if we were to do a 2% drawdown twice, that would keep us above the 12% at a certain point, but would really have the alarm bells going. So that was about as far as that qualitative assessment was.
Right. Well, it does, with the range being about, 5% from bottom to mid. I think there's some rationale there as well. I know for state reserves, there's some maybe some guidance that would say that that's not necessarily the best. We're not a state, and so I'm not sure exactly how that interacts. That those sorts of statutory caps complicates council's ability to respond to an economic situation. But also, I think as long as it's written in that it's overridable, like this is guidance, then that would be probably pretty appropriate. Yeah. I think also, so City and County of Denver has a reserve policy that gets a lot into especially the dipping below the acceptable range. And I like how that is written and some of the immediate, like freeze on any new spending initiatives, immediate repayment plan, those sorts of things. It might be worth considering that as well. I'm happy to find that and try to get it to Tyson to circulate.
Yeah, if you can, that'd be great. And of course, we know what's going on in Denver. And so this is a very good way for us to see it from an outside perspective. And we should also see how they operate, because I know they're laying people off. And that's not a situation we ever want to be in, right? But I think it's a really good gauge for us to see another municipality go through this.
On that, can you use those benchmarks and does Denver do this, to furlough days, to giving furlough days if you drop below a certain point? Or would that maybe not happen until you get below 12%?
I don't know. I think that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot of backing. I don't know that I saw that specifically in the policy language, but worth maybe a deeper dive.
Can I just ask, and I'm not familiar, but are there any collective bargaining agreements or things like that in Inglewood that would affect council's ability to implement reductions or furloughs or things like that? Because I think Denver encountered some of that.
We have a few collective bargaining units, and I think this year they agreed to 1% increases. So, but as far as, I don't know what happens if you want to, take some of that away.
How difficult would it be for us to get at least a view into the agreements, just so we can see how this would affect, if at all?
Easy, they're public record.
All right.
Yeah, that can be done.
I wanted to share as well, I know there's a lot more specifics to go through, but maybe some details around replenishment strategy as well. I think that is an easy win to be able to write in just some guardrails around making sure that if we're going to dip in, that we have a plan to replenish as well. And so I think this is from the current policy, but when the general fund balance falls below the minimum, which I'm assuming is 12%, the city will fulfill the required year-end fund balance before any other budget allocations in the subsequent fiscal year. But that is only addressing the replenishment when reserves are falling below the minimum, but not guidance for drawing down. And so I think it would be worth, again, I think there's a question of how much, like if we're dipping to 16.2%, do we need all of this? So maybe we need a better threshold here. But yeah, maybe some recommendations would be, and this is direct from some of the state guidance, but a time horizon. What's important philosophically with this is that the purpose of these reserves is to smooth out economic challenges, economic dips, some of these cyclical impacts. And so when you are too strict and too immediate on that replenishment policy, it can actually work counter-cyclically or kind of against. And so maybe establishing kind of a base time horizon. I think I've seen 3 to 5 years. I think 3 years maybe is what we put in the annual report. But with discretion to extend during slow recoveries. I think 2008 was something like 4 years for some of the states in the case studies. Percentage of recovery rule. So the big kind of guidance here is that instead of just putting in, you have to repay a third each time, but looking at for any annual general fund surplus, it's at least 50% and, potentially can ratchet up more. And some sort of conditional rebuild requirement with a replenishment plan. That might be overly onerous, especially between 12 and 16.7%. Those were a few things I wanted to pitch for consideration by this council.
I think that's great. And maybe we can define a time period within the policy subject to an override by city council, right? But I think this is a really important piece.
Yeah, again, I really appreciate these recommendations and you putting this together. I similarly like the idea of, maybe trying to make this less onerous for minor adjustments and more involved should a larger correction be necessary. I will also say that I think I'd like for us to be careful before we get too into the logistics of recommending layoffs or furloughs. One, because I think that that is a whole rabbit hole of policies, but two, to your point, the purpose of these funds are to make it so that if, there is a bad summer and the city doesn't get the revenue that they're expecting, that we aren't suddenly in a position where we lay off half of our staff and then make the situation 10 times worse. So I think, hopefully, any future councils will have the common sense that if we're in like an ongoing situation where expenses are greater than revenues, then that they might consider layoffs or furloughs anyways. But, I don't know that I think most of that's going to be relatively intuitive in the sense that I think hopefully future councils will have the understanding that if that's, continually the situation. And I don't know necessarily that we need to include that into our recommendations.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the philosophy that we've adopted behind this policy is to prevent knee-jerk reactions to corrections that we can write out with our savings, which is the purpose of it.
I think, Nevin, what you're talking about is maintaining this as a strategic document and not a tactical or operational level document, and leaving that to the finance department and others who are doing the work day to day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think where we're ending up, we've had some agreements. We've gotten feedback from our council liaisons. I think as far as action items, where we want to go from here is an agreement on the use conditions. With I think there was some audible agreement on those 5 that I don't know if it's up or down from here, but down, yep. So those 5 right there, which, again, we can, I would expect that 90% of the situations that we would be looking at would be some form of this. We can always add those 1 or 2, like Chair Eccles said. So use conditions, triggers with their trackers and conditionals. So that graphing mechanism, just to see, some of these are going to be yes, no. Some of these are maybe a scale, and then some of them may be a graph. I don't think it has to be too complex than that. And then the third is the replenishment strategy. I think those 3 things, if we had those, decisions could be made, but I'm willing to listen if I miss something. Okay.
Can you please send those to Tyson?
These 3?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And then I will circulate my notes, but I think unless anybody else has something to add to that, I think that's the next step for us, which, I'd like to make some progress between now and next meeting. And I think those are specific terms and things that we want to present.
I would add also a determination of operational expenditures instead of whichever is more predictable.
Yeah, I agree. That needs to be
I think
changed.
that's an easy one. And how much of this would require kind of a policy draft that has to be voted on versus is kind of guidance to council based on these items?
I think that's a question for council. I mean, a policy draft versus specific guidelines that would be implemented into a policy. And what does council envision this to be? envisions it to be presented. So, hey, here's what we think should be done, or here is a draft policy update, and here are some of the things that should be considered.
I like what you said. Here are some of the things that should be considered, and some of those things are very helpful to me as well. Like especially the trigger for when, if there's a 2% drop, we need to start looking at this before it gets any worse. I mean, because that's one of the things that we were talking about probably 2 or 3 years ago, about where is it that you, all of a sudden, the finance director comes to council and says, we're in trouble. So.
And so that would or wouldn't include us formulating sort of a draft policy.
It would. I think this is ripe for an issue brief, frankly, which has been done by the body previously, not in quite some time. But when the Budget Advisory Committee decides to submit an issue brief to council mid-cycle, one of the things that council can do is ask for a study session with the Budget Advisory Committee. And I think you guys have spent so much time looking at these specific policies. Many of my peers have not. So it would benefit them to see what this is, how you came about it, and what it would mean citywide in the budgeting process. And it would inform future discussions on reserves, regardless of whether or not council decided to take any action on it.
Thanks, that's helpful. Anything else on this for today? And I will tell you, I'm going to work on this tomorrow and send it to Tyson for the group. Jay's going to send his notes because it's fresh in our minds, and I think we really need to keep this one moving now that we got it going. And thank you, Laura, for all the time, and everyone else for your contributions.
Does the committee, do we think it would be helpful to have another study session for the committee before our next scheduled meet? I don't know what people's schedules look. I have 2 weddings this month, so I mean, if we could squeeze it in, it'd have to be very specific. But
I don't think it would hurt. Now, if it's more than 2 people, we would need to disclose that as a meeting. So I think I'm open, if the group's open to suggesting that we should do that, I think we can do it. And what's on our schedule next month?
It's the capital improvement prioritization process, working on the tool, which I don't think, my sense of it is won't be as detailed or time consuming as this process is. So I wonder if we could commit part of our time the next meeting to this process, a continuation, if we can't fit in a separate study session.
my question, why I brought up the study session, is I just don't know how fast we want to move on this. And it feels as if it is a very high priority right now.
And a ton of work. And I don't want to take anything away from CIP because that's also really important. And I think some of the things we presented this year, we got a lot of feedback from council and the city on. So.
And just a reminder, I will not be here during our meeting on October 2nd.
Do we want to propose an extra meeting then between now and October 2nd?
Yes, I think it would be helpful.
Okay, so motion to have a meeting between now and October 2nd, specifically to follow up on the information that's going to be circulated from this meeting and then make some guidance decisions so that we can finalize within, I'd say, 20 to 30 minutes in the October meeting and maybe move to an issue brief with City Council. Do you have a motion for that plan?
Could we include a specific date and time in that motion?
Yes. And with a specific date and time of?
I'd recommend September 18th, that would be 2 weeks from today, or the 25th, that would be for your October meeting.
25th, I will be deep in my second wedding. So 18th would be great for me.
Okay, go ahead, James.
I won't be available, but that should not be a factor in this group's setting the meeting date. I've got my board meeting and our largest Southern Colorado fundraiser, so I'm out for the whole day.
You do too much for other people, James. Okay, so motion for the stated meeting, September 18th. So I assume that would be here in this room?
Yes, it would be.
Okay, and it'd be a 5:15?
Yep.
Okay, so motion to have a meeting for reserve policy discussion for BAC, September 18th, 5:15. Can I get a motion to?
I'll move.
Seconded. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Just to be sure, because I know that we're moving around a lot with the scheduling. There's no other committee that's going to be showing up that day?
The only other committee is the library board, and they do meet in the library.
Okay.
But I will also confirm that.
Thank you.
Before, stating anything.
What might be helpful feedback from the committee is once those, the portions that we think are necessary can get circulated, I think it'd be really helpful to just get everyone's comments on them and even just strikeouts of things that they don't feel are necessary. Votes of confidence. So I would love to see, feedback on those items that get circulated before we meet, if that's possible.
Would it be helpful to put it in a Google Doc like you do for your annual report so that way folks can add comments in there? Just again, with the knowledge that more than 2 people can't be putting comments in at the same time, and you can't be responding to each other's comments in there as well.
You can't be responding to comments at all.
I think that would constitute a discussion, which would be a public meeting.
Yeah. Thanks for the reminder. But yeah, a Google Doc would be great.
And are we going to edit this document, or do you want a new document with the 4 items that we've outlined?
I would say a new document with the simplified, and we can use some of this context for issue brief if and when we get there.
Okay, great. So we're looking forward to Jay's email to Tyson.
Is there a specific structure to an issue brief that I need to be aware of? Roger that. Thank you.
As the Inglewood emblem makes it, I think we're okay. Members' choice. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's really important, and I appreciate everyone's contributions. And thank you, Laura, too, for taking the lead on this.
Thank you all for everything you do. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Meeting adjourned.